The last couple discussions that we've had have looked at the experience of Rome in the aftermath of the Second Punic War. And you can see on this map the Roman Republic in 201 BC. This is the territory that Rome controlled at the end of the Second Punic War, the defeat of Hannibal. And then in the orange, you can see the territory that Rome absorbs in the next 100 years. What you can see is in that century, the territory of Rome, which was already extremely large by Mediterranean standards in 201 BC, effectively doubles. And the last couple lectures looked at the impact that this has in a Roman context. First, by introducing new people and new activities and new influences in Rome, and then also by the fashion in which these new influences and new peoples cause a degree of disquiet and unease among certain Romans at the rapid rate at which their society is changing and becoming more diverse. What we're going to do in this lecture is talk about what happens to Rome because of these changes. In particular, what happens to the Roman Republic once the Republic controls an empire. And what we have to understand is that the initial impulse, the initial pattern through which Rome comes to dominate these territories is one of initially trying to withdraw from many of them. And Rome does not, after the Second Punic War, want to control Africa. Rome does not, after the Second Punic War, want to control Macedonia or Greece or the province of Western Asia Minor. It really actually prefers to outsource control of this territory and management of the affairs in these territories to the people living there. And the freedom of Greece under Flamininus and the other efforts that Rome makes to withdraw from Greece after winning victories there show quite strongly the unwillingness or the disinterest that the Republic has in immediately assuming control of these territories. But as we saw by 146 BC, Rome is stuck. Rome had to come back 4 times to fight in Greece. And after the last time that Rome came back, it inflicted terms on Greeks that basically resulted in the absorption of Greek territory and the integration of Greece and Macedonia into a Roman structure. Now, the Republic owning an empire, which after 146 it undoubtedly did, required Rome to figure out how it was going to administer this territory. Because if you remember in Italy, the structures that Rome used to bind together the various peoples that it had defeated in war or brought into Roman political sphere of influence, those features had been integrative. They had created a Roman commonwealth made up of places and people that enjoyed Roman citizenship, but also allies that participated in a free and full way in the process by which Rome made decisions and functions. Once Rome starts expanding outside of Italy, though, it stops building this kind of commonwealth structure, and instead it starts building a structure more or less governed by administrators who control territory for a fixed period of time, but the people in that territory don't have any say in who those people are or really in what they're doing. There's appeal processes that are established against the governors of what will be called Roman provinces. But the appeal process doesn't work very well. And actually what the Roman government decides to do, the Republic decides that it is not interested in big government. The Republic decides that it doesn't want to build a large government bureaucracy to administer these territories, collect taxes, extract minerals from mines. Instead, what Rome does is it contracts out the administration of much of the economic affairs of these provinces to investors. And so investors bid on contracts to collect taxes, to run the mines, and to do all sorts of other things that the Republic required them to pay the full cost of up front. And the scholar Philip Kay has shown that this arrangement actually spurs a financial revolution in Rome because no bidder had the cash on hand to cover something as large as, say, the mining revenue from parts of Spain or Macedonia, or eventually the tax revenue of the province of Asia. Most of these contracts that come up for bid are multi-year contracts, and the bidders have to pay the entire amount up front. And so most successful bidders had to take out loans to cover the costs of their bid. And the loans would be paid back following the end of the contract. But these things that people were bidding on, generally speaking, were predictable. You could understand what profit margin you would get and how much more beyond the amount you bid you were likely to net. And so what this meant was, if you were sophisticated enough, you could realize what value that loan would have. And Romans quickly realized this. They quickly realized how to value the loans that were taken out by investors looking to collect taxes or operate mines. And they could figure out the likelihood the loan would be repaid, the likelihood it would be repaid in full, and how much additional income it would generate that would be the profit that potentially the lender could share in. And the Roman innovation was to see that a price could be set for the resale of large loans that had a calculable value. And so reselling the loan would recapitalize the lender, who could then make another loan, which he could again sell to generate more investment capital. And this process quite literally created money, in the way that financial securities in the United States now create money. It's not physical money. When you sell a mortgage-backed security and you recapitalize yourself, you're not actually getting and printing more dollar bills. What you're doing is creating financial instruments with a monetary value that, if someone wanted to, they could convert into actual money. And so these financial instruments that Romans were selling and creating had a monetary value. And understanding this has revolutionized the way that we understand the Roman economy. Because what we had thought, say, 60 years ago, was that the Roman economy was basically a low growth to no growth economy, where most of the wealth was based on agriculture. And therefore, there was a finite amount that one could extract from soil. And therefore, Romans couldn't, simply put, grow the economy in a way a modern economy grows, because a modern economy, in many ways, grows through things that are intangible, like financial instruments. And so the old economic model held that the Roman economy was a very unsophisticated economy that was based largely on trade of tangible things. And wealth then was held in either precious metals or land. But the old economic model then would hold that Rome was effectively stagnant, and it's clear this is not true. It's clear, for example, that there are moments when political disruptions produce economic shocks like the 2008 crisis of confidence in financial instruments that crashed the world economy and caused the massive recession, the Great Recession of 2008. So an example of this comes actually in the 80s BC. In 87 BC, a man named Mithridates of Pontus kills a group of probably tens of thousands of Roman merchants in what's now Western Turkey, and then captures the free city, the free sort of trading site of the island of Delos. This is Delos as it looks now. And perhaps as many as 25,000 Roman merchants and families are killed. And this sparks a financial crisis. It sparks a financial crisis not because a significant amount of precious metal or land holding left the Roman economy. That actually didn't happen. What actually happens is the loans backed by the people who were killed in these massacres suddenly become valueless. And so all of the money that's based on the buying and selling and reselling of loans disappears, because those loans now will not be collected. The people responsible for those loans do not exist. And so their debts go away. And this creates a massive problem with the money supply. And what's interesting is a very, in a sense, modern response. So in 2008, with the crash of the US financial system, the Federal Reserve starts doing things like called quantitative easing, where they're basically injecting large amounts of money into the economy. And they're effectively making up for all of the money that was destroyed when subprime mortgages were no longer being repaid, and all of the financial instruments based on those subprime mortgages cease to have any value. That destroys money in the economy. That's why the economy collapsed. And so what the Federal Reserve did in 2008 was it recapitalized banks by injecting money into the economy and replacing that money that was destroyed when those bonds became worthless. Rome actually does something very similar in response to the crises, the murder of these Roman merchants in 87. The Republic mints some of the largest ever issues of denarii, the silver coin that is the basis of the Roman financial system in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC. Now, what's interesting is the denarius is a 4-gram, effectively pure silver coin. And what the Republic does in the 80s is it mints incredibly large numbers of these denarii. And this shows a couple of things that are important. First of all, what Rome is doing is it understands quite clearly that the death of all of these people and the destruction of the financial instruments that they back were effectively things that could be rectified. The financial impact of them could be rectified by printing more money. And so what Rome does is it prints massive amounts of more money. But in the United States, our money is basically a piece of paper. In the Roman world, the money that they print is silver coinage. And the fact that the Republic understood, first of all, that it would be able to effectively respond to a destruction of large amounts of money when these loans became when those loans lacked any value in the future, by printing more money meant that they understood the nature of a very sophisticated economy. But second of all, they had large amounts of silver sitting around that they could rapidly mint. And so not only did they understand the nature of the problem they were trying to solve, but they also had planned how they would respond to it should such a problem arise. And so this shows very clearly that Romans understood the nature of the sophisticated financial system that they had, and they understood how to respond, and they planned a response so that the resources were available if a crisis like this appeared. And so what we see is a very, very sophisticated understanding of economic principles and macroeconomic principles in particular in the Roman Republic. And as we move later in time, what we see is the Roman government actually not only had the capacity to respond to financial crises, but the government actually uses financial instruments to fund social programs. And so the clearest example of this actually comes from the empire. And so outside of the context of the discussion that we're having right now, but it shows how the principle of financial instruments could work as a sustainable way of funding government programs. And so the clearest example of this is something that's called the alimenta scheme that's pioneered by the emperors Nerva and Trajan around the year 100. And the alimenta is a central government-funded financial system through which individual cities sustained food production, food distribution to poor people, education, and other forms of social welfare to support underprivileged citizens. And what we see in the implementation and the construction of this system is that the system is fully and entirely based on financial instruments. And so the program begins actually with a fiscal stimulus to the local economy, because cities are not obligated to participate in this program. They become eligible for it only if a critical mass of wealthy citizens decide that the city wants to participate. But once enough people in the city indicate their interest in the alimenta, Trajan issued loans to the wealthiest figures in the city, on which the borrowers paid a perpetual below-market rate of 5% interest. And the borrowers in turn then invested the money that the emperor loaned them in their home city. They certainly were generating more than 5% return on it. This is why they would agree to participate in it. And so it stimulates immediate economic growth because the government has basically pumped money into these cities. But the loan payments, the interest payments that the borrowers pay to the treasury then provide the funds that support poor children and parents. And so the entire alimenta program works not off of an annual amount of money that comes out of the government budget, but instead out of basically financial instruments, the offering and reselling of loans, and then the interest payments that come from it. And if you look at this, you can see this is the propaganda that Trajan issues to advertise his alimenta program. So on the left is a coin, and you see there Trajan handing out things to poor children, right? And on the bottom it says aliment, or alim Ital, alimenta Italian. So this is for the people in Italy. And then on the other side, in Benevento, in southern Italy, you see a representation again of Trajan and these poor children who are being given resources from Trajan. That again is the alimenta. But again, what we have to understand is this is a social welfare program that's funded by financial instruments. It's funded by loans and the interest that is paid to loans. And it is a sustainable program. Um, But the clearest evidence that we have, this is how we can see the level of understanding that Romans have of this financial system. But the clearest evidence we have for the revolution in the Republican period comes from just simply comparing the resources available to the wealthiest people on both sides of this revolution. So in 190 BC, our richest man in Rome is Scipio Africanus. This is the man who defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama. And his net worth in 190 BC, this is just following the victory at the Battle of Magnesia, is 700,000 denarii. So again, denarii are those 4-gram silver coins. And Scipio Africanus is far and away the richest man in this primitive Roman economy. But the financial revolution changes this, because the money that Scipio Africanus possesses is, again, it's a lot of money, but it is in tangible form. It's in coins and precious metals and property. It is money that, again, is that primitive economic model that for many, many years everybody assumed was the nature of the Roman economy for all time. When we move a little bit more than a century forward, we get to Crassus. And we'll talk about Crassus more in subsequent lectures. But Crassus in 70 BC was worth 42,600,000 denarii. So this is 60 times as wealthy as Scipio Africanus. But unlike Scipio Africanus, very little of what Crassus owned would have been in cash. Very little would have actually been in tangible form at all. And it's actually impossible that this wealth would have been in cash. Because the 4 grams of silver that a denarius makes up would mean that Crassus's holdings, if he held them in silver coin, would weigh more than 175 tons of silver. Likely more than all of the coined silver in the entire Roman economy in 70 BC. And so this is not money that Crassus could have had in cash. There's questions of storage. There's questions of what the rest of the economy would do if he had this in cash. Instead of a pile of cash, what we know is Crassus had an incredibly diverse investment portfolio. So we know that he lent money to tax collectors. We know that he lent money to people engaged in commerce. We know that he lent money to ambitious politicians. We know that he bought other loans, sold loans. We know that he owned extensive farms and agricultural properties. We also know that Crassus had a major stake in apartment buildings that had sprung up in the city of Rome. So this is a denarius. This is 4 grams of pure silver. And when you talk about Crassus's real estate, what we see is a very, very sophisticated operation. So we're told that Crassus liked to flip properties. And he had a staff of 500 engineers and architects and craftsmen who would help him do this. And they took particular interest in buying buildings that were burned out, or in some cases actively burning, so that he could rebuild the buildings at a profit. So Plutarch in his Life of Crassus says that Crassus observed how natural and familiar with Rome were fatalities such as the conflagration and collapse of buildings, owing to their being too massive and close together. And so he proceeded to buy slaves who were architects and builders, and then when he had over 500 of these, he would buy houses that were on fire and houses that adjoined those that were on fire. And these the owners would let go at a small price owing to their fear and uncertainty that the house was either ruined or about to be ruined. And in this way, the largest part of Rome came into his possession. And what Crassus then did was he rebuilt these buildings. He used his architects and his builders to reconstruct them and sell them at a profit. And so he's flipping property. And he's doing it in a particularly hot real estate market. But the flipping is what's key there. He's not holding this property. Some of it he is, but some of it he's not. What he's basically doing is taking advantage of a very fluid financial system. Now, the thing that happens when you have an economy that grows so rapidly using financial instruments is something that's quite familiar to us. Wealth does not flow equally across the entire economy. And so the wealth that grew out of Rome's economic expansion as the economy revolutionized and became based on finance was not equally distributed among Romans. So some people like Crassus benefited far more than most, and their riches fueled a rise in conspicuous consumption. And so by the middle part of the 2nd century, large villas are constructed along the main roads and along the seasides. Lavish dinner parties are held in these villas that feature exotic foods like ostrich steaks and flamingo tongues, and stories begin to circulate about what these rich people are doing. And so, an example of this is this story that's told about the son of Aesopus, the famous actor. And the story that's told is that the son of Aesopus wanted to swallow 1,000,000 sesterces, so that's about 250,000 denarii. 1,000,000 sesterces in one drink, and so he dissolved in vinegar a precious pearl which he'd taken from the ear of Metella. How much wiser was he in doing this than if he'd thrown the same into a rapid river or the common sewer? So what you have here is a situation where people are literally disposing of money just simply because they can do it in a really foolish way. Now, this is a story that we'll see a couple of other times in this class. It's a story that's also attached to Cleopatra. It's also attached to the Emperor Caligula. We should be very, very skeptical of the fact that anyone actually did this. But the fact that we have this story describing figures at this moment when conspicuous consumption is becoming so prominent highlights something that I think says more about concern about inequality and concern about basic fairness in that economy than it does what these guys are actually doing. But these concerns about inequality and fairness sit alongside something else. Many of the people who did this kind of stuff, people who ate ostrich tongues, people who built villas along the seaside, people who were said to swallow pearls in vinegar, these people could afford it. And these people got the money that allowed them to do these crazy things legally. It was not stolen money. It was money that they had earned. And if every Roman had seen their income increase, this sort of ostentatious spending would be considered tasteless, but it wouldn't be a political problem. But the danger that Rome faces is that conditions in the middle part of the 2nd century made these wealth displays very concerning because they occurred while Rome's middle class saw its economic prospects stagnate. And this is important because the first half of the 2nd century BC, so the period from, say, the end of the Second Punic War through basically around the destruction of Carthage in 146, was a time when both the Roman rich and the Roman middle class did well. And this is because that period was like the period after World War II in Europe and the United States. Like the world after World War II, there was a significant amount of rebuilding that needed to be done. And if we're being blunt, there were a lot fewer people to do that work because many, many, many people had been killed in the war. The same was true in Italy after the invasion of Hannibal. Italian infrastructure had been devastated by nearly 15 years of war, and the Italian population had been devastated by fighting that war. And so the first 2 generations born after the defeat of Carthage at Zama had lots of opportunities to get land cheaply. If you were born in 200 BC, there's lots of empty land in Italy that had been confiscated from Roman allies who've rebelled and joined Hannibal. There's lots of land that was available because of people who had died. And there was also lots of opportunity and lots of jobs for people able to do that work. And so the first 2 generations born after 200 BC had a lot of opportunities to get land or to build market for their products or to find work in the cities. And the rich were definitely getting richer. But the middle class and the Roman poor also saw their prospects improve because the demand for their labor and the opportunity for them to set up a new start for themselves also was expanding. So everybody shared in the economic growth fueled by Roman expansion in that period. But by the time we get to the late 140s, the economic tide had stopped lifting everybody's boat. And so the Roman rich continued to get richer, but with Italy now rebuilt and repopulated, the economic opportunities for poorer Romans began to dry up. And so after 2 generations in which children could expect to be richer than their parents, the Romans coming of age in the 140s BC realized that in all likelihood they would be poorer than their parents. Now they wouldn't be starving, but they wouldn't do as well as they had hoped. And this is because in part, the way that Romans distributed lands to their children was they distributed the land equally. And so if a man had 3 sons, he would distribute his farm in thirds, and each son would get a third of the farm. Now in the aftermath of the Second Punic War, the man who goes out to try to get a farm might get a relatively large farm in some of this public land or some of this abandoned land that was now suddenly available. And then he has 3 sons. So he divides the farm into thirds. Now, those sons are still going to do pretty well. Um, but, if he divides that land in 175, say, and then those sons all divide the land in 150 or 145, all of a sudden the large farm is now a smaller farm. And the people, the second generation, the grandsons of those people, of that man who had settled that farm in 200 BC, now do not have a large farm. They have a farm that is perhaps so small that they can barely make a living on it. And so they've gone from being the children of someone who's relatively well off and the grandchildren of someone who's definitely well off to basically people who are scraping by. They're not dying, they're not starving, but they're not doing as well as they grew up with the living standards that they grew up in, and they're definitely not doing as well as, say, their grandfather was doing. And so the Romans coming of age in the 140s are frustrated because their prospects are stagnating or dimming, but the rich continue to get richer. They can see the villas when they travel the main roads towards Rome. They hear the stories of their wasteful spending and they get angry. And the Republic struggles to respond. Across the 140s, there are all kinds of things that politicians propose to do. So politicians talk about sending Romans out as colonists to new lands conquered in northern Italy so these people can get a new start. They propose tweaks to the laws that allow people to rent public land to farm. But popular discontent is rising too quickly for the Republic to arrive at a kind of consensus-based political process. So if we think back to how Polybius described the Roman constitution working, you have the consuls, you have the Senate, you have the popular elements, and they're supposed to check each other and work together. They're supposed to find common solutions so that the Senate and the aristocratic element of the Constitution are supposed to not be greedy. The popular politicians are supposed to not be faction producing. They're all supposed to work together and find consensus about how to deal with the problems Rome faces. Polybius is writing this right when these problems are becoming clear. But not at the point where it's become clear that these problems are going to disintegrate the Republic. A century later, though, the Roman orator, politician, and philosopher Cicero said, had a different view of what some of the issues that one faces in a republic at that moment can actually be like. So Cicero in the 50s BC writes a work called The Republic. And Cicero says that a republic, a res publica, is the property of the people. And a people is not a collection of humans assembled in any old way, but a collection of a multitude joined together to one another by a consensus about law and the common good. And this is a principle that I think Polybius would have agreed with, but it's a slightly different principle than what Polybius describes. Because what Polybius is describing is a set of independent, in a way, structures that balance each other. What Cicero is saying is these structures are wonderful, but they're not the point of the Republic. The point of the Republic is to build a common consensus among everybody who's a Roman citizen about what law and what the common good is. And the problem in the 140s is the Republic is struggling to find a way to uphold both law and a commitment to the common good. This is because the Roman super rich had become rich lawfully, and the just exercise of law should have protected the wealth that they had legally acquired. But the common good suggested something different, because regular Romans largely did not agree that the level of wealth that the richest Romans are getting is good for the Republic when everybody else is struggling to keep pace. And this is true regardless of whether the rich people are getting their wealth according to the law or whether they're getting it illegally. Even if they get this property legally, it still isn't good for the Republic. And so steps to enhance the common good by addressing wealth inequality would undermine the rule of law unless the rich agreed to them. And steps to protect the property of the wealthy would seem just only if there was broad agreement to them. And consensus, if Romans could find it, could lead Rome out of this moment of tension. But consensus takes time to develop in a representative democracy. And the problem is that Cicero's view of the Republic and Polybius's view of the Republic are at tension in these moments of conflict, in these moments of sort of struggling to deal with really profound internal problems. Because Polybius sees a natural and productive tension between the different elements of the Republic. In a sense, if the people want to do something, but the aristocracy or the consuls don't agree with it, the consuls or the aristocracy can block that from happening. What Cicero is saying is it actually shouldn't be a situation where people are blocking each other. What they should instead do is work together to find a common consensus about law and the common good among all citizens. And so the problem in the 140s is, how do you reach this consensus while those structures that Polybius outlines as serving a really important function of checking the excesses of other parts of the government remain intact? And in the 140s, Romans couldn't find that. As the 130s start, Roman patience begins to run out. And as the 130s dawns, a new generation of politicians come of age who see political opportunity in this popular discontent. And so they begin by championing a series of voting rights laws that make it possible for Romans to vote by secret ballot. And so these are a couple of images of how Romans vote. The first of these shows voting in an election. The coin on the right is a coin issued by a man named Nerva, and not the emperor, an ancestor. But what you see is Romans walking along a platform carrying ballots that they then drop in a basket. And then you see underneath this the basket, the ballots being counted. On the left, you see a vote about legislation. And this shows somebody carrying a token, and the token has a V on it, or a U on it. And that is the token that would be used to indicate that the person has voted in favor of something. And again, you see it being dropped in that basket. The U stands for euthi rogos, which means sort of as it was said. But with secret voting possible, and this is secret voting, you drop your token into the basket. You could cover it with your hand if you want. No one is supposed to see what you're doing. With secret voting possible, Roman politicians suddenly feel empowered to push policy in a much more factional direction. And the most prominent of these people is a man named Tiberius Gracchus. Now, Tiberius Gracchus is a kind of unlikely radical. He's the son of a man named Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus and Cornelia, who is the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the Scipio Africanus who prevailed over Hannibal at the Battle of Zama. And Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus is a very prominent plebeian politician who initially conflicted with Scipio Africanus, but they come to get a sort of mutual understanding and respect for each other. And so the marriage of Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus and Cornelia represents a joining together of one of the most prominent plebeian families with one of the richest and most important families of the generation that won the war with Hannibal. So when Tiberius Gracchus, the politician of the 130s, is born, he's born at the highest sort of elite level of Roman society. And very early on, he's seen as the kind of golden boy of the Roman upper class. So we can see this by looking at the story of his marriage. And this is a story that's told where Appius Claudius, and we've seen many Appii Claudii in this class so far, but Appius Claudius is he's a member of the Claudii, the family, one of the families that is a leading patrician family in the Roman Republic, and he's a descendant of the Appius Claudius who speaks to prevent Rome from making peace with Pyrrhus. It's a very esteemed family. And so it's notable that Appius Claudius, who's a man who himself held the offices of censor and consul, greeted Tiberius, expressed his regard for him, and went on to offer his daughter's hand in marriage. And Tiberius gladly accepted, and the betrothal was agreed upon at once. Later, we're told, when Appius Claudius returned home, he called out excitedly to his wife from the doorway, "Etistia, I've betrothed our Claudia." And his wife answered in surprise, "Why so suddenly? Why are you in such a hurry unless you found Tiberius Gracchus for a husband?" So what we see here is a story that's told just simply to illustrate the prominence and the potential that Tiberius Gracchus was seen to hold in Roman society. He is seen quite clearly as the most promising and the most esteemed Roman politician of his generation when he's young. And Tiberius begins his political career in the same way that most upper-class Roman youths did, and he again shines in this role. So he first served in the military campaigns of the Third Punic War, the war that ended in 146 BC with the Roman capture and destruction of Carthage. And it's said during that war he served very closely alongside his cousin, Scipio Aemilianus, who would become Scipio Africanus the Younger. Scipio was the general who would destroy Carthage. He's different from Scipio Africanus I, who defeated Hannibal. Same name, same family. And Tiberius Gracchus is, of course, a figure who is going to be well known to Scipio because he is his cousin. He's related to him. Now, what we're told is, according to Roman custom, Tiberius Gracchus shared a tent with his commander, and it was not long before he learned to appreciate Scipio's character. The older man was a model of soldierly virtue and provided a constant example to imitate and rival these qualities in action. And Tiberius soon came to surpass all the young Romans of his age in discipline and courage. And so we see that Tiberius Gracchus is still moving along this course for rapid ascent to greatness in the Roman world. And following his service, he's elected quaestor, the official who kept the financial accounts of an army, and he was sent to Spain to serve on the staff of the general Gaius Gracchus, who was fighting to put down a rebellion in Spain by the city of Numantia. Now, Gracchus is a really bad commander. And he allowed his camp to be surrounded by forces from Numantia. And it's not Gracchus, but it's Tiberius who eventually manages to secure a truce in which the Roman forces are released, but the plunder the Spanish troops had taken from the surrendering Romans was not returned. In the account books of Tiberius, who's quaestor, meaning he's keeping the financial records, his account books were said to be among those things that were captured, but he arranges for them to be returned. And then when his year of service is up, Tiberius returned to Rome. And this is a significant turning point in Tiberius Gracchus' career, because he expects that he's going to return to Rome a hero. Somebody who maintains this reputation for just conduct and dutiful service to the Republic. And he expects he's going to be commended for saving the lives of the Roman army and also getting the account books back from the Numantines. But what he actually finds is when he returns to the capital, the whole affair had aroused a storm of indignation and was being denounced as a disaster and a disgrace to the name of Rome. And on the other hand, this is coming, the denunciation of what Tiberius had done is coming from elites, largely elites, who want to go and fight Numantia. They want to reopen the peace treaty because they feel like they now have cause to go and defeat Numantia. But the relatives and friends of the soldiers, who formed a large part of the citizen body, came flocking to Tiberius and blamed the general Gracchus for everything and insisted that it was through Tiberius's efforts that the lives of so many citizens had been saved. Now, this public outcry saves Tiberius Gracchus from prosecution, but it also means that his career as a creature of the establishment is over. And what Tiberius Gracchus really realizes at that moment is he has been discarded. And not only has he been discarded by other members of the elite, but particularly he's been discarded by Scipio Aemilianus, the person who ultimately does go, reopens the war with Numantia, and captures and destroys the city of Numantia in a campaign in 133 BC. What Tiberius quickly realizes is the people that he thought were on his side, the people that he thought were his champions, the people that he thought were his patrons, are completely willing to dispose of him when it's convenient and it enhances their own prospects. And what Tiberius also sees is the citizens who came and insisted that Tiberius should not be prosecuted because he saved so many citizen lives. This seems real to Tiberius. These are people who put things on the line. They put their lives, they put their reputations, they put lots of things on the line to make sure that Tiberius's interests were protected. Those, he sees, are his real base of support. And he also realizes that since the elite path is now cut off to him, he either needs to retire politically or reinvent himself around the support of that base of population that came to his aid in a way that was somewhat unexpected to him. And he chooses the latter. He chooses to embrace the desires of that populist group. An account written by his brother Gaius describes how Tiberius was transformed from a player who was part of the system to a radical who wanted to reform it. And so this is the story that Gaius Gracchus tells. Gaius wrote in a political pamphlet that while Tiberius was traveling through Etruria on his way to Numantia, he saw for himself how the country had been deserted by its native inhabitants, and how those who tilled the soil or tended the flax were barbarian slaves introduced from abroad. And that it was this experience that later brought so many misfortunes upon the two brothers. Now, there's an important thing to understand about this. Archaeological evidence has shown that it is not true that most agricultural land in Italy in the 130s was being farmed by barbarian slaves. Most of that land remained in the hands of relatively modest family farmers. It was not a country of massive estates tilled by armies of slaves, but it is true that by the 130s there were massive estates along some of the main roads that Tiberius Gracchus would have taken on his way to Numantia. And so it isn't true that the country, that Italy, was deserted by its native inhabitants. It is perhaps true that Tiberius Gracchus saw parts of Italy that are like this, but what's even more important is that Italians felt it was true. They felt that the situation in Italy was such that the interests of Italian citizens, and especially Roman citizens, were not being protected. Instead, the rich were dominating in a way that made it impossible for the poor to thrive. And regular people knew this. They knew the rich were getting richer. They knew that regular people were stagnating economically, and no one quite understood how to fix the problem. And so what Tiberius decided to do was to capitalize on this outrage and to use the support he had from regular people and the anger that a lot of these regular people were feeling about a Roman society that suddenly felt unfair and unjust. Tiberius was going to capitalize on this, and he used this outrage to win election to the office of tribune of the plebs in 133 BC. Now, the tribunate, as we've seen, gives its holder the ability to propose laws to one of Rome's assemblies, and Tiberius hoped to use that position to restart his political career. Now, it's important to understand Tiberius is a reformer, but he's not a reformer who actually has good solutions to the problems that are making Romans upset. What Tiberius understood was that a lot of reform is packaging, it's marketing. And Tiberius was motivated not so much by solving the problems, but by giving voice to the anger that regular people were feeling. And he was motivated in doing this by a cynical pursuit of personal power and an anger that he shared with regular Romans at his former friends in the Roman elite who he felt had wronged him and he felt were wronging regular Romans, his regular Roman supporters. And so this meant that Tiberius Gracchus was more interested in channeling anger at elites than he was at solving economic problems. And this is why, in isolation, Tiberius's policy proposals actually are pretty moderate. So Tiberius begins by suggesting that wealth inequality can be addressed by taking public lands that wealthy farmers are leasing and giving poor Romans some of the land that comprised the largest of these farms. Now, the rule here was a very old one, going all the way back into the period when Rome is expanding rapidly in Italy around the end of the 4th century BC, early 3rd century BC. Romans had established a rule that said that people could lease public land taken from defeated adversaries, but they couldn't have more than 500 jugera. This is a Roman measurement that basically means 500 jugera basically equates to about like 350 acres. And so it's a substantial plot of land, but if you had more than 500 jugera under cultivation, that was violating the law. But after the Second Punic War, there was so much empty land that Romans began ignoring this because they needed that land to be farmed, so it didn't basically revert to wilderness. What Tiberius recognizes in 133 is there's a lot of people who are now cultivating land illegally in excess of that 500 jugera limit, and it's possible to just take back that land that they're cultivating illegally because they don't own it, they're renting it. And so you just cancel the leases on the property beyond 500 jugera, and you redistribute that land to landless people. And what Tiberius's initial proposal said actually was, he will even compensate the farmers who lose property above the 500 jugera, even though they have it illegally. It will compensate them for losing the lease on that land, and compensate them for any improvements that they've made to that land. And so this is not by any means a radical proposal. And in fact, something very similar to this had been proposed by a consul in 139 BC, so 6 years earlier. But the Roman establishment isn't ready to endorse this reform. And part of the reason why is a lot of the people who held that land were Italian allies. They were citizens of allied Italian states. They were not Roman citizens. And so a lot of the opposition was basically geared to the fact that this is Roman public land being rented by Italian allies who had helped win the war that got Rome this public land. But the redistribution of the land was only going to go to Roman citizens. And so the economic impact was going to be felt disproportionately by non-Roman citizens affected by a policy that the Roman state was implementing simply for the benefit of Roman citizens. And so these Italian allies, the wealthy Italian allies who'd be affected by this land redistribution, work with Octavius, a tribune who is one of Tiberius's fellow colleagues, and Octavius vetoes the proposal. And he vetoes the proposal in part because he doesn't agree that the impact is something that Romans and Roman allies should be asked to sustain. What Tiberius then does is he brings together an assembly, and backed by angry crowds, he holds a vote where he orders Octavius deposed. And Octavius is deposed, and once he's deposed, then the law passes. And when the Senate then refuses to back funds to support this, Tiberius then again mobilizes supporters, gets angry crowds together, and has the concilium plebis pass a law that redistributes land and property and money that had been given to Rome by the king of Pergamum, who had died in 133, and used this money that was supposed to go to the central treasury, that was supposed to be administered by the Senate. This money is now going to be used for the land redistribution project. Now, Tiberius's moves here are not illegal. Tiberius could certainly call an assembly together. He could certainly say that the tribune who was elected by the people should be deposed by the people. He certainly could hold a popular vote that gets the concilium plebis to pass a plebiscite that says that the money given by the king of Pergamum to the Roman people should be distributed to benefit the Roman people through land reform. All of these things were legal, but the way in which this was done is unprecedented. No tribune had ever been deposed in this way. No plebiscite had ever been used to take control of finances. Finances, of course, are supposed to be under the purview of the Senate, not the concilium plebis. But even more alarming was that Tiberius Gracchus had done this not by persuading people, not by building consensus, not by doing the things that Cicero says are important for a functioning republic, but by using threats and intimidation. No one had been hurt, but a lot of people had been scared. And so this violates the principle that Cicero said was necessary for a republic to work, this consensus about what's law and what's lawful and what's just. It also violates the separation of powers that Polybius had laid out. Because what Tiberius has done is he has short-circuited the ability of the Senate to actually perform its role in managing the financial affairs. He's also short-circuited the checks and balances that colleagues and magistrates are supposed to exercise against each other. And so this is something that in no way is illegal, but it violates the very basic constitutional principles that first govern Roman separations of power, and then second govern this process through which Romans are supposed to generate consensus and compromise. And Tiberius then follows this up by announcing that he plans to run for re-election to the tribunate. Now again, not illegal, but Romans generally only held the tribunate once. They didn't usually run for re-election to it, so it's unprecedented, even though it's not illegal. Now, Tiberius, it's important to emphasize, never used physical violence to push through his new laws or to back his election campaign. But his actions so alarmed his opponents that they thought he might eventually resort to violence. And they thought he might even use it to take over the Roman state. And so rumors about Tiberius's desire to take over the Roman state as a kind of new king, these begin circulating. And a few senators, actually decide to try to block Tiberius before he had the chance to do this. And so one of them, Tiberius's cousin Scipio Nasica, arms a group of supporters and they attack Tiberius and Tiberius supporters while voting is underway. And so Tiberius and a number of his supporters, maybe 100, 200 of his supporters, are killed in this rioting. Now it's important to understand that the Roman Republic was not a place that was filled with political violence. This is actually the first lethal act of political violence in over 300 years. And Romans desperately wanted to believe that it was an aberration. But it wasn't. It was actually the beginning of a process through which the Roman Republic would degenerate into violence and murder. And later Romans understood this. So the biographer Plutarch would write that this is said to be the first outbreak of civil strife in Rome that resulted in bloodshed and murder since the expulsion of the kings. Now, Plutarch is not technically true there, or not technically correct there, because there was another outbreak of violence in the 440s that resulted in somebody being killed. But he's almost right. It's been 300 years since we have a documented case of actual political murder in Rome. And Plutarch continues and says, the people felt bitterly about the death of Tiberius Gracchus. And they were clearly awaiting an opportunity for revenge. And since Nasica was already threatened with prosecution, the Senate, fearing for his safety, voted to send him to Asia, even though it had no need of him there. For when the people met Nasica, they didn't try to hide their hatred of him, but they grew savage and they called out upon him wherever he chanced to be, calling him an accursed man and a tyrant who defiled with murder an inviolable and sacred person, and the holiest and most awe-inspiring of the city's sanctuaries. What they're talking about here is the fact that Scipio Nasica, who actually was the Pontifex Maximus, the supreme religious figure in the city of Rome, killed a tribune, and a tribune who is protected, who is supposed to be sacrosanct, who literally is protected by the goddess Ceres. And so is he accursed? Yes, quite literally, he's supposed to be accursed because he killed someone who's protected by a goddess. This, to common people, represented an overreaction by Roman elites who couldn't actually stand to allow the regular Roman population to express their anger. This did not actually calm anything down. Because while the regular people, supporters of Tiberius Gracchus, criticized Scipio Nasica for using violence in a context that isn't supposed to see violence at all, other Romans lionized Nasica as a defender of the Republic. So Cicero, for example, saw Nasica as a Roman patriot who acted heroically to save a city that was destabilized by the constitutional violence of Tiberius Gracchus. And Cicero described Tiberius Gracchus as an overly ambitious person who divided the Roman people into two factions, two senates, two separate populations. For as you see, the death of Tiberius Gracchus, and even before his death, the whole character of the tribunate divided the people into two factions. And so Tiberius's murderers, Cicero said, filled the entire world with the fame of their names. A more measured assessment comes in the 2nd century AD from the historian Appian, who blames basically both sides for sparking violence that to him is a genuine cause of the decline of Rome's republic. Tiberius, Appian wrote, was the first to die in civil strife. And this made him a figure whose death polarized the city between men who mourned him and those who saw in him the fulfillment of their deepest hopes. And Appian then noted that Tiberius was killed on the Capitol while still a tribune because of a design that he pursued violently. And then he goes on to say that some people mourn for themselves and for him and deplored the present conditions of things because they believed that the Republic no longer existed but had been supplanted by force and violence. Now let's unpack this for a second, because Appian really has his finger on some significant insights about why Tiberius is such a dangerous figure in Roman politics. Tiberius Gracchus, of course, his murder sparks a wave of, well, not a wave, it sparks a tradition of using, or a pattern of using violence politically. And he dies because he was pursuing a most excellent cause. The most excellent cause is, of course, addressing the inequality in Roman society. But he didn't pursue this appropriately. He pursued it violently. And so Appian is sympathetic to what Tiberius is trying to do. I mean, the problem he's trying to solve, a problem of dispossessed Romans who feel alienated by the sorts of things going on in their society. But Appian does not condone the fact that Tiberius Gracchus is using threats and intimidation to do this. And after his murder, what Appian says is, this isn't a republic anymore. It's not a system of government based on political compromise, peaceful dispute, peaceful contesting about the direction of the state. It's instead something that now we'll see its decisions, its arguments, and its policies decided by threats and violence. And so Appian sees the murder of Tiberius Gracchus as a sort of signal change in the way that Roman politics works and the way the Roman Republic works. Cicero would agree with this. Cicero says that this habit of lawlessness changes our rule from one of justice to one of force. And through our own generation, Cicero is writing now in the 50s BC, we may be vigilant enough to be safe, but I'm anxious for our descendants and for the immortality of our republic, which is capable of lasting forever if the customs and laws of our ancestors are maintained. What Cicero is saying here is that the violence, the lawlessness, the breaking with custom and with tradition, this is something that changes the republic, just as Appian said, from a republic that's governed by justice and lawfulness to one that's governed primarily by violence and intimidation, by force. The Latin word here is vis, or vim. And our generation, Cicero says, may well survive this. But the republic is capable of lasting forever if the laws and customs of the ancestors are maintained. But it cannot last if violence and force is something that comes into Roman life. Now, it's a mistake to imagine that the murder of Tiberius Gracchus immediately plunges Rome into a century of unremitting violence. It didn't do that. The violence that flared up around Tiberius Gracchus fades away. And it fades away for about a decade. That's long enough for Romans to believe that the Republic actually remains sound. The massive inequality that produced this conflict is something that they can perhaps ignore. And political violence is a one-off thing. You know, they saw it and now they don't have to worry about it. And in our context, in a 21st century context, we can understand this. Political violence is something that has hit the United States, and it's something that concerns all of us. But it's also something that we desperately, desperately don't want to think about all the time because the consequences of it are so terrifying and so terrible. And Romans were the same way. They did not want to think about the horrible nature of a Roman society governed by violence. And so they didn't. They wanted to believe their state was calm and safe. And so they believed it. They sort of hid from their conscious understanding of the world around them the fact that violence was now part of the way that Romans could imagine political disputes unfolding. And it's natural to think this way. The average Roman lived to be about 50 years old, assuming he or she made it out of infancy. And so they likely saw only one or perhaps two serious political crises in their adult life. And so Romans with this sort of life experience could be forgiven for thinking the Republic was strong again when the crisis they experienced had ended. And even Cicero, who who argued that Rome could last forever if it remained governed vigorously by its citizens. Even Cicero said, our republic is capable of lasting forever, but only if we maintain the laws and customs of our ancestors. Basically, that lasted for a decade. Romans tried their best to imagine the murder of Tiberius Gracchus as a one-off overreaction to a unique set of provocations. But after a decade, it became clear that this wasn't going to continue to be something that all Romans could do, because the shock at the murder of Tiberius Gracchus and what it meant to live in a society where political violence now occurred gradually wore off to the point where Romans, angry about the inequality that had only gotten worse since the murder of Tiberius Gracchus, again became enchanted by a powerful rhetorician promising a new Rome, a new way of the Republic working. This actually was Tiberius's brother, Gaius Gracchus. And Gaius is a spectacularly talented orator. Cicero himself calls Gaius the best Latin orator who ever lived. But Gaius was not just a really powerful rhetorician, he was also a gifted policymaker. And so Gaius serves as tribune of the plebs in the year 123 and 122. And he embarked on a large policy program that he hoped would actually address some of the causes of the discontent that Tiberius had cynically tried to capitalize upon. Now, Tiberius, of course, didn't really try to solve the problem. He instead channeled anger in a fashion that made people feel good, but didn't actually address the underlying causes. What Gaius tried to do was to channel this anger productively, so that some of the underlying causes of this regular Roman discontent about the direction of Rome could actually be addressed. Now, once Tiberius is elected, the first thing he does when he's in office is to secure the forced exile of the people who were responsible for killing Tiberius Gracchus. And this was something that was initially quite popular, but it's also something that was just a precursor to a much more productive sort of activities that came together in a large and significant reform program that Gaius proposed. And the program had 5 really key elements. The first was to reinstitute the judicial powers of Tiberius Gracchus's land commission so that the redistribution of land could proceed much more aggressively. And this was something that was done, and it was done, of course, both because the land commission was his brother's legacy, but also because he believed there was some positive that could come from it. The second thing was even more important. He created a public grain dole. Now, what this represented was a sort of registry so that people could get publicly subsidized grain. Any Roman citizen in the city of Rome could register for this and get publicly subsidized grain at reduced cost. And this was a way to be sure that regular Romans were not starving if they were in the city of Rome. The next thing was to propose a military reform, where the state would provide military equipment for soldiers, and so this would remove some of the burden of serving in the military from people who were really struggling. The fourth step in this was, in some ways, the most controversial, because Gaius Gracchus proposed establishing colonies in southern Italy and also in North Africa. And the colony in North Africa was to be on the site of Carthage. Now, on the one hand, this is a great way to give landless people a new start, and a colony on the site of Carthage was something that would, of course, put people in an economically really advantageous location. There was a reason Carthage became powerful and wealthy, because its location was so favorable. And so putting a colony in Carthage was something that was immediately appealing. But what we see is the proposal ultimately led Gaius Gracchus to have to go to Carthage and scout out the location. And this meant that he spent 3 months outside of Rome working on figuring out the logistics for the colony. And what ended up happening in response to this was other Romans, other politicians, began pushing more aggressive colonization programs while Gaius Gracchus was gone. And so when Gaius Gracchus was gone, he moved his rhetorical powers out of the city of Rome, and other people came in and started promising Romans even more than Gaius Gracchus was proposing. But these other people making these proposals were not figures who actually ever intended to deliver on them. What they were doing, in essence, was undermining the support that Gaius Gracchus enjoyed by outbidding him. And so Gaius Gracchus proposed a few colonies. They proposed a lot of colonies. Gaius Gracchus proposed some resources for this. They proposed more. And what they were doing, in essence, was saying, well, we don't need the baggage of, they were making people decide that they don't need the baggage of Gaius Gracchus because supporting somebody else actually would get them even more. And so while Gaius is in Carthage, his popularity declines significantly. But one other thing that particularly impacts his popularity is a proposal that he made to extend citizenship, Roman citizenship, to all Italian allies. And there's some background to this. The biggest problem that this was aiming to address was the fact that Tiberius Gracchus had proposed reforms that disadvantaged Italian allies, but only gave benefits to Roman citizens. And what Gaius Gracchus was then doing was trying to rectify this. He was trying to make it so that the Italian allies who were disadvantaged by policies proposed in Rome, but had no voice, no direct voice in shaping those policies, now would have a direct voice in shaping those policies and also the opportunity to benefit from those policies. And part of why this was something that was appealing to Gaius Gracchus was in 125, the allied city of Fregellae had revolted against Rome because it wanted to get Roman citizenship. And the reason that the people in Fregellae had revolted was simply because they felt that Roman politicians were making decisions that disadvantaged Italians, but the Italians had no say in making those policies, and they got no benefit from those policies. And so they were feeling more and more like the Roman system of government was taking advantage of Italians for the benefit of Roman citizens. And the solution to this was obvious. Give citizenship to the Italian allies who had fought alongside Rome and had got all of the benefits from, or had gotten Rome into the position where it could win the war that got it all of the benefits that had made Rome wealthy. Now, all of these things had been brought about because what Gaius had been able to do was link the desires of the Roman citizen population with a real set of reform program that offered legitimate responses to some of their concerns. But Gaius was proposing really radical things. And these were dramatic things and dramatic shifts from how Roman society had worked before. But it's important to note a couple of things. First, unlike Tiberius Gracchus, Gaius used persuasion, not violence or intimidation, to push for these reforms. But instead of actually allowing him to sail through this without a violent response, instead, these persuasive techniques sort of foundered after Gaius went to Carthage to try to organize the colony. He came back, and at the end of 122, he found himself outside of office. And once he lacked the power of the tribunate, and once he lacked the popularity that he had had in the first year that he'd served, senatorial figures began trying to undermine some of his policies. And the most central of these was undermining the setup of the colony at Carthage. And so when Gaius and his supporters came forward to try to speak against the defunding of the colony at Carthage, the Senate declared a public emergency. And one of the consuls for the year 121 then used an armed band of civilians to attack Gaius and his backers, and perhaps as many as 3,000 people died. Gaius's body was dumped in the Tiber River as a message that the city had now been purified of his noxious person and brand of politics. And again, violence had emerged at a moment when political confrontation developed in Rome. But what we see is the violence inflicted against Gaius Gracchus was more organized and actually straight up authorized by the Roman Senate. And so this shows the pattern that will become particularly dangerous in the later Republic. Violence has emerged in Roman society, and violence then becomes a political tool. And once political violence emerges, people become better at understanding how to use that tool more precisely and with more devastating effect. And so when Tiberius Gracchus is murdered, it's basically a riot. It's a riot that kills a political leader, but it's basically a riot that also takes out maybe a couple hundred people. By the time Gaius Gracchus is killed, this is a state-authorized use of violence that kills not hundreds, but thousands. We are already seeing this getting, the use of violence getting amped up, getting increased. And we're seeing that now the level of violence has become so profound that people will seek to respond or respond preemptively so that violence is never used against them. And this will become the story of Roman politics for the next almost 80 years.